Ever since the inception of powered flight, mankind has been able to traverse the globe with increasing speed and ease. But when catastrophe strikes in the air, the outcome can be devastating.
I see the plane! The engine fall down!
Many of the dead still lie indiscriminately along the runway, are so badly burned as to defy identification.
It's a horrible, horrible accident.
Whether it is human error or mechanical failure that downs an aircraft, there are multiple steps along the way where tragedy could have been avoided.
It's never one thing. It is a cascading series of links that lead to this mishap.
Sifting through the wreckage of some of history's worst disasters, we can learn the lessons that make air travel the safest form of transport today. Around the world, humanity exists only moments from catastrophe. Disaster bubbles below the surface of the earth, strikes from the heavens, or engulfs us from the sea. But we are not merely at the mercy of our planet. In our pursuit of industry, global connectivity, and reach for the stars, lives have been lost. Disasters reveal the best and worst of mankind, as one tragedy compounds another. How do these disasters occur? And what lessons can equip us when catastrophe strikes again? Every day, more than 100,000 commercial flights travel to their global destinations without incident. Subject to extensive checks and guided by a sophisticated set of protocols, GPS, radar, and onboard computers, flying is the safest it has ever been.
Unsafe is a relative term. There is nothing in aviation that is inherently safe except for staying in bed. So you're always flying around 5 or 10 miles above the earth at minus 33 degrees Celsius and flying at 500 miles an hour. So you're always balancing and mitigating risks.
In 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was loading up in Amsterdam Airport Schiphol, with mainly Dutch passengers keen to start their holidays. Like so many other aircraft that day, the Boeing 777 received flight clearance before leaving the gate, under the direction of ground control. Once ready for departure, final takeoff clearance would have come from the air traffic control tower before MH17 took to the skies. The 12-hour journey would transport the 283 passengers and 15 crew over 10,000 kilometers to Kuala Lumpur. But MH17 would never arrive, and piecing together the plane's fate would require knowledge gained from air crash investigations of the past. The world's deadliest flight disaster occurred in the Spanish Canary Islands 40 years ago. Before 2 Boeing 747 jumbos had even left the tarmac.
Many of the dead still lie indiscriminately along the runway, are so badly burned as to defy identification.
The Tenerife accident is the worst accident in aviation history, with over 500 people dying.
As is almost always the case in fatal air accidents, not one, but a series of things went wrong. The year was 1977, and in the last few years, large-scale commercial aviation had truly taken off.
This is the age of the jumbo jet. So we have airplanes that are bigger than ever before, flying farther than ever before, with more passengers than ever before.
Not all airports were equipped to cope with the changing demands.
The main airport in the Canary Islands is Las Palmas. A bomb had gone off in the Las Palmas terminal. So all those airplanes, they were diverted to a secondary airport on Tenerife.
Tenerife was not an airport which was designed for that heavy traffic.
It is a single runway and a single taxiway. Well, where do you put big airplanes? You can't put them on the runway because then nobody will take off or land. So you put them on the taxiway. That means that when you land, use the runway as a landing area and a taxiing area. So that's the situation that we had.
More than 2,000 feet above sea level, Tenerife's airport was subject to sporadic whiteouts. Awaiting instructions for takeoff that day were two loaded jumbos. Pan Am Flight 1736 and the Dutch KLM Flight 4805. KLM received instructions to taxi down the main runway, and Pan Am to follow. Pan Am were then advised to take the third exit.
The crew of the Pan Am flight missed the taxiway.
Now, with the fog, they couldn't see each other. The air traffic controller couldn't see either aircraft either. So they're all working on radio procedures.
KLM turned 180 degrees and readied for takeoff.
So the clearances to taxi were given. The problem was that the KLM aircraft began its takeoff run before it had formal takeoff clearance. It appears that the captain had confused a departure clearance, which is a clearance for the aircraft to depart in a certain procedure, with the takeoff clearance, which he didn't yet have.
KLM radioed at takeoff. The controller responded, "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." But in a tragic moment of radio interference, a loud squeal covered most of the sentence. Pan Am had stepped on the transmission.
The problem with transmission reception is you can't both transmit and receive at the same time.
Pan Am's communications had blocked KLM's, and KLM's captain only heard, "Okay."
Rather than listening to that and saying, well, maybe there is some uncertainty, let's double check, he was all, kick the tyres, light the fires, let's get off and get in the air. KLM captain tried to lift the KLM aircraft off the ground to go over the other aircraft, but it wasn't able to do so. So it hit the other aircraft smack centre in the fuselage.
The entire first-class cabin behind the cockpit was torn out of the Pan Am craft, which immediately caught fire. KLM plunged back into the tarmac, erupted in flames, and disintegrated, killing all on board.
This collision remains a gruesome, horrendous tragedy.
"583 people lost their lives in the Tenerife collision. In the investigation that followed, the cause of the accident was put down to several factors.
It was the combination of many factors, organizational factors in KLM, airport geometry, congestion of the airport, and the air traffic controller being basically unprepared for that volume of traffic.
Ambiguous radio transmissions from both aircraft crew and traffic controllers was compounded by the poor visibility and lack of proper procedural checks.
As an ex-air traffic controller, it sounded like he cleared him to take off.
Every pilot learned a lesson on that day about foggy days means double check again, make sure that you know where all the other aircraft are.
Unlike the KLM flight departing Tenerife, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 took off without incident, setting a course for Kuala Lumpur at a cruising altitude of 330, 33,000 feet.
MH17 was following a normal flight path, but there were a lot of abnormalities that attended this mishap.
MH17's flight path involved passing over Ukraine.
Коли вкрали надію у людей, надію в завтрашній день у кожного з нас.
Where an armed conflict was taking place.
An aircraft had been transiting that route over the Ukraine for years. The trouble is, of course, is that there was an insurgency, and it got worse in the preceding week or two. Been some unmanned aerial vehicles actually shot down in the same area.
Я дошла только до второго дома и сразу услышала этот звук сумасшедший.
In 2014, what began as anti-government protests escalated into a Russian-backed armed rebellion.
The Ukraine Civil Aviation Authority established some flight restrictions. Do not fly below flight level 320 as we get closer to the conflict zone. Malaysian Flight 17 was legal. They were legal, but they weren't safe.
Вот дома обычных жителей. Мы сейчас ехали, в багажнике люди выезжают, уже беженцы, мы дожили.
By July, the Ukraine government was trying to suppress rebel forces with air attacks.
There's a war on the ground. That is an unusual situation. Most surface or shoulder launch missiles can operate to about 20,000 feet. You know, what else is down there? You don't know.
Many other companies had taken explicit action to reroute the aircraft.
Although several airlines were now avoiding airspace over Ukraine, Malaysia Airlines was not one of them. When MH17 reached the city of Dnipropetrovsk, air traffic control requested MH17 climb to 35,000 feet to avoid a potential separation conflict with a Singapore Airlines flight. MH17 replied that they were unable to do so, possibly due to weather conditions, and requested to stay at their current altitude. This request was granted, and Singapore Airlines moved to 350 instead. Separation conflict is the aviation term for an unsafe distance between aircraft.
Normally you can figure 1,000-foot separation. Think of a hockey puck of airspace around an aircraft, and the job of the ATC controller is to keep that hockey puck safe for that airplane.
If aircraft experience a loss of separation, they can be at risk of collision or a wake turbulence encounter. It was wake turbulence that led to horrific scenes in Queens, New York, just 2 months after 9/11.
The accident occurred in clear skies, so anybody watching from the ground can see the entire incident.
Hundreds of residents in Bell Harbor watched in horror as a passenger jet broke apart in midair and plunged into their neighborhood.
I see the plane. The engine fall down. The pitch then left side and make it straight all the way down.
Burning engines and debris showered a 5-block radius, killing 5 on the ground and all 260 people on board.
Everyone across the US thought this was terrorism. And so this is a community that has already been devastated by aviation-related disasters, and this was another one right on their doorstep.
As investigators recovered pieces of the plane, a major clue was pulled out of Jamaica Bay: the vertical stabilizer, or tail fin, of American Airlines Flight 587.
Completely normal. This is what you would expect on this flight path, all the way down to here. This is where we have the last transponder return. The impact is very shortly thereafter.
The vertical fin appeared to have been torn off in mid-air.
The vertical fin gives you directional stability.
Without it, the aircraft became uncontrollable.
What could have caused this type of damage on a perfect blue sky day, just a couple of minutes after takeoff? The preliminary investigation quickly ruled out terrorism.
An aircraft took off slightly ahead, and it was a Japan Airlines 747. They're very heavy, of course, and they create quite significant wakes.
When a wing produces lift, it generates a low-pressure region above the wing and a high-pressure region below the wing. It causes this circulation around the wings, and this generates these vortices, one from each wing.
Air safety regulations require planes to be separated by at least 4 miles on takeoff to avoid wake turbulence, a rule that was followed in this case.
American Airlines aircraft was informed, caution, wake turbulence.
Shortly after the plane took off, the pilot encountered what he believed to be the cautioned turbulence.
The first officer stomped on the rudder pedals rather heavily with full rudder deflection left and right in order to correct the wake turbulence,
which got the vertical fin going back and forth at a rate that exceeded the design load. The fin broke off, which the rest of the accident just followed on after that.
Aircraft just crashed to the top of the field. It's a huge fire, tremendous amount of black smoke.
The official findings were pilot error by the first officer, who employed unnecessary and excessive use of the rudder.
The question that's raised here, though, is why would a reasonable pilot do this? That causes into question, what was the training? The second thing would be, did the manufacturer tell the users to avoid extreme input in the rudder pedals?
We're doing everything we can to deal with this, and I know that the people of New York can rise to any challenge.
In addition to pilot error, the National Transportation Safety Board found that training by the airline and poor rudder design were major contributing factors.
This pilot had a previous occasion where he'd overreacted to aircraft wake turbulence, and this was traced back to the training.
The first officer commanded a series of aggressive control inputs to the rudder pedal that maneuvered the airplane into a large oscillating side slip.
As MH17 tracked over eastern Ukraine, It was not just other aircraft that posed a potential threat. Approaching the Ukraine-Russia border, radio contact went dead.
The aircraft was flying peacefully along on its cruise altitude, and the next minute was plummeting to Earth.
On the ground, eyewitnesses caught the last moments of MH17 as a fireball on the horizon.
Но я видела, как она летела сверху. Вот так, летела, 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 крутилась, крутилась. Аж шлакоблочина, что шлакоблочина даже упал.
Across a wide expanse of villages, paddocks and farmlands, aircraft pieces and bodies rained down. They fell in fields, through roofs, into gardens.
It was spread over 50 kilometers. And that's not just wreckage, but the unfortunate victims as well.
The suspicions of what had caused MH17 to fall from the sky over a conflict zone were immediate. The West claimed the plane had been hit by a surface-to-air missile fired by pro-Russian rebels. The Russians suggest that a Ukrainian government jet had shot down MH17. The Ukraine government immediately shut down its airspace to any further traffic.
С неба одна женщина упала в кресле прямо в одной бабушке через дом, абсолютно голая. Улетела.
Ukrainian emergency workers began the process of locating bodies.
Initially, Ukrainian authorities, for doing the investigation, they realized they could not do it in an unbiased manner. So they called in the Dutch authorities to do the investigation.
The kind of approach to all of this work is to do things as quickly as possible. Time is of the essence too.
There were reports of pro-Russian separatists tampering with the wreckage and blocking access to the site, delaying the investigation.
There were times when the accident investigation team would advance to near the accident site, and there would be too much shooting, or mortars would come in, and they said, we just got to get out of here.
Villagers, trapped in the middle of a conflict they didn't start, were now key witnesses to an international air disaster.
Я бы не полетела, потому что боюсь тоже, как вот эти невинные люди, упасть.
The investigation in MH17 involved lots of local people assisting in the recovery of remains. That is obviously a really challenging thing for any community to be involved in that sort of work. People who don't see deceased people, don't see body parts as part of their ordinary daily life, often find it very, very hard, either at the time or sometimes months and years later.
Less than a week after MH17 went down, bodies began arriving in the Netherlands for examination and identification.
That situation, you have two processes running in parallel. You have the humanitarian process, which is about returning the deceased to their loved ones. And you have the forensic process, which is about collecting the evidence which may be used in a subsequent court proceeding.
With remains ranging from full bodies to small body parts, the identification process could range from weeks to months.
Pre-screening a body, looking for foreign material or dangerous objects, taking fingerprints, looking at their personal possessions, having all that documented in a way that families could actually receive those personal items. Then you'll move on to the areas where you're going to look at features that can be used to identify them and compare that with clinical records of a missing person in life.
As hard as it may be to comprehend a commercial airliner full of passengers being mistakenly shot down, it's happened before, by a US naval ship. The year was 1988, towards the end of the Iran-Iraq War. On the morning of the 3rd of July, a guided missile cruiser, USS Vincennes, was in the Persian Gulf in Iranian territorial waters. It was engaging small gunboats. Around the same time, Iranian Air Flight 655 was taking off from Tehran's Bandar Abbas Airport, heading for Dubai. It was a routine, scheduled international flight. During the firefight, using their state-of-the-art Aegis combat system, the USS Vincennes immediately began tracking Flight 655. They claimed it was sending out squawks on a military frequency from its transponder.
Radar works on the principle that the radio signal goes up and hits the airplane and comes back. You measure how long it took to get from here to there, and you'll say, well, that is 10 miles away by the amount of time it takes. Transponders are what are called secondary radar. The radar signal goes out and it hits a receiver on the airplane. And that receiver squirts back 4-digit code that says, I am 1234.
The crew interpreted what they received as the aircraft being an F-14. The only operators of F-14s at that time were the United States and the Iranian military.
The naval crew began sending out multiple challenges to the aircraft. But according to a report by the International Civil Aviation Authority, 7 of these were on a military channel inaccessible to the flight, and 4 on the International Air Distress Channel. Only the last challenge clearly identified Flight 655's transponder code. There was no response from the flight crew.
The activities in the area would indicate that there may be hostile aircraft at that altitude.
Assuming it was a hostile F-14 Tomcat, USS Vincennes took action.
The United States Navy ship fired a missile at the Iranian Airbus. Destroying the aircraft and everybody on board.
Their mistake cost the lives of 290 civilians.
It was an environment outside of the norm of civil aviation. In a war zone, civil aviation is greatly compromised. Civil aviation should not go on in the same way as it normally does in peacetime.
Within days of the MH17 air disaster, Dutch authorities received part of the plane critical to any investigation: the black boxes. But they revealed little.
Everything was fine right up until the tapes stopped.
Although investigators couldn't tell what had caused the crash from the black box, they could tell where it occurred. By triangulating the recordings from the microphones in the cockpit, the investigators were able to discern that the cause came, suspiciously, from outside the aircraft. A useful lead, but ultimately, the greatest hope for determining the cause of the crash was the wreckage. It arrived months later in the Netherlands, transported on flatbed trucks under police escort. Piece by piece, the remnants of MH17 were painstakingly assembled.
In most cases, they will start laying them out horizontally on the hangar floor, then build a jig to start mounting all these pieces onto in order to get the aircraft back to the original condition as possible.
As the front of the plane took shape, the cause of MH17's demise became clear.
There are certain types of damage that are attendant to an explosion. There are penetrations to the aluminum fuselage. There are traces of explosive that are left behind.
Self-evidently, if there was a bomb, the explosion outwards would leave rips in the fuselage, which would indicate an explosion towards the outside. Whereas in this case, there were actually holes in the fuselage, which indicated that the fuselage had been penetrated by shrapnel from outside the aircraft.
They started doing experimentation with what size warhead it would take to be able to cause that amount of damage and how far away from the aircraft it would have to be in order to get the shrapnel pattern that they had on the skin.
The Dutch Safety Board reached their conclusion in October 2015. MH17 was shot down by a Russian-made Buk 9M38 surface-to-air missile. Fired from territory held by pro-Russian separatists. Buk surface-to-air missiles can travel at 3 times the speed of sound, to a range of 80,000 feet. They are designed to seek out fighter jets, detonating just before hitting their target.
Ze van begin af aan al weten wat er gebeurd is.
Beetje angstig. Ik denk dat politiek te gevoelig ligt.
In the case of MH17, confirming the information garnered by triangulating the black box recordings, it exploded to the left and above the cockpit. The force of the blast caused explosive decompression, resulting in both the cockpit and the tail separating from the fuselage.
Unconsciousness would have been within a few seconds. They would have been surprised and then they'd have been asleep.
Now, where the Buk missile came from, there was evidence that it had come from a vehicle which had crossed from the Russian side into Ukraine.
Despite multiple lines of evidence supporting a Buk missile strike, Russia continued to deny any involvement.
Фрагменты какие-то ракетной установки, которые...
У нас есть протоколы по этому поводу, после чего их использование было запрещено, и ракеты были сняты с вооружения российской армии.
While tensions between the East and the West hampered investigations into the MH17 crash, historically, they've accelerated aircraft research and development. In 1960, the KGB caught wind of a combined French and British program to design a supersonic commercial aircraft called Concorde.
The Concorde could fly at Mach 2, so it could fly more than twice as fast as a normal airline. And it could fly way higher, above 50,000 feet.
During development, Concorde was reportedly the subject of a massive espionage effort by the Soviet Union.
The political environment at the time, it was like the space race, which is going on at the same time. They wanted to get their supersonic transport in the air and flyable before the Concorde.
The Soviets' famed aerospace engineer, Andrei Tupolev, was put to the task. The aircraft he designed, Tupolev Tu-144, beat Concorde to the skies by 2 months in 1968. The West was furious. The craft was so similar to the Concorde that it was nicknamed the Concordski. Dart-like in their appearance, with distinctive delta-shaped wings, the two aircraft were hard to tell apart.
The delta wing has several advantages for supersonic flight. One, its attachment to the fuselage is sturdier.
The delta wing design reduces drag by delaying the shock waves that occur as the aircraft approaches the speed of sound. Designers of supersonic aircraft found that the delta wing increased stability at high speeds. But at lower speeds, the aircraft needed to maintain a high angle of attack, a profile that created vortex patterns along each leading wing edge.
The vortices that were generated by the wings created a much higher low pressure area over the wing, which enhanced the lift.
But there were key differences. The Tu-144 was longer and its engines more powerful. It also had distinctive moustache canards, retractable foreplanes near the cockpit, that aided stability and lift. It was this design feature that indirectly became the focus of a horrific air accident before either aircraft entered commercial service. The site was the Paris Air Show in 1973. The East and West were finally coming head-to-head in a full display of supersonic rivalry. Before a crowd of 350,000 people, Concorde flew first.
They went and performed for the crowd, very mild, just show off that this airplane can fly. The Russian crew decided that they wanted to show off. In the process of showing off the airplane, they exceeded the structural limits.
After a low pass over spectators, the Tupolev pilot entered a show-stopping steep climb. He then took the aircraft into a dramatic descent. Frantic efforts to pull out of the dive failed.
It broke apart in air and came apart right over the town.
The entire crew were killed, along with 8 people on the ground. More than 60 people were severely injured. The spectacular disaster triggered intense debate and finger-pointing. The Soviets blamed the aircraft's severe maneuver on a French fighter jet, which was in flight at the same time. The West counter-accused the Soviets of espionage, blaming Tupolev's structural flaws on stolen, false Concorde plans. Whatever triggered the disastrous mid-air disintegration, the tragedy sent the development of the Tupolev into a downward spiral. Concorde took the lead and became the first supersonic aircraft to enter commercial service in 1976. Concorde was in a class of its own. Faster than a speeding bullet, it could rocket passengers from New York to London in just over 3 hours. With tickets only the rich could afford, Concorde quickly became a symbol of wealth and prestige. It was also considered one of the safest aircraft in service. Until a catastrophic crash more than 2 decades later. A smoking wreck of ash and debris was all that remained of a hotel in Gonesse, France, after being hit by a Concorde on the 25th of July, 2000. The Air France flight crashed shortly after taking off from Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport. 4 staff in the hotel were killed, along with 100 passengers and 9 crew. The accident was caused by a metal strip from an engine cowl door, but not from the Concorde. The piece had come loose from another plane, which had taken off 5 minutes prior.
Well, there was nothing wrong prior to him starting the takeoff roll except that metal strip on the runway, which he wouldn't have been able to see.
The part had been replaced in Houston during a check earlier that month.
But every part on an airplane is made to a specific design, and if it is not done, then that becomes an unapproved part.
The replacement part was neither manufactured or installed to specifications. It was to have fatal consequences for those on board the Concorde. As the tire ran over the debris, it exploded under enormous heat and pressure.
A big part of the tire came up and hit the fuel tank. And then the expulsion of jet fuel was ignited.
As the captain lost thrust on 2 engines, the landing gear jammed, and he was unable to lift the plane high.
Unfortunately, the fire that took hold was very fierce. The heat from that quickly took effect and shut down both of the engines on the left side. The aircraft rolled left and crashed into the ground.
So it shows how dependent the end product of safe aviation is upon what might appear to be the smallest little part.
Although the horrific crash was blamed on the small piece of runway debris, Concorde's tires had previously been a feature of concern.
The tires are subject to extreme heat and weight. Several years before the accident, the NTSB investigated 4 incidents having to do with tires coming apart and striking the airplane.
Tragically, modifications to the Concorde's fleet were not made until after the crash.
They changed the tires so that they could better withstand some of the speeds. They also put Kevlar around the fuel tanks on the aircraft. But the decline of the Concorde program had already started. The Concorde accident happened at a very bad time for the airline industry. Revenues were down, people weren't flying as much. The Concorde program itself was always a very, very tight budget.
3 years later, Concorde made its final transatlantic journey. The final journey of MH17 forced airline operators to reassess the balance between hazard avoidance and the cost efficiency of direct routes.
In the context of what was going on in the weeks and months before, it is very likely that they thought they were shooting down an airplane from Ukraine.
She was for peace, she is for peace, and she will be forever for peace.
The question is, how can we improve this system to make it safer? Because that's the end goal of any aircraft accident investigation.
The airlines are now far more thorough at doing their risk mitigation around conflict zones. So that's been something which is going to have far-reaching positive effects.
While risks were known at the time of a disaster, an adverse event was thought to be incredibly unlikely.
It's an unlikely event, and the trouble is many accidents are unlikely events.
Often when we hear of something like this, we'll say, how could anyone ever do this? Who could be so stupid? But that's the wrong question. Right question, how could this make sense? How could someone think that they were doing the right thing? And that applies to every aviation mishap.
The legacy of the 298 people who lost their lives on board MH17 is a greater understanding that the unthinkable can happen.
But it is time for action because it's just terrible.
And must be avoided at all costs. In an increasingly modern age, industry has spread to almost every corner of the globe, managing the raw materials to fuel an ever-increasing population. However, as we mine, transport, and store volatile substances, we are constantly at risk of disaster.
We have confirmed fatalities.
Hundreds have perished due to the improper storage of chemicals.
The Tianjin explosion is one of the most terrifying pieces of footage.
500,000 people, they got affected.
Ecosystems have been ravaged.
The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was absolutely devastating in terms of its ecological impacts.
And nations have suffered from nuclear fallout. As industry only continues to grow, we must examine the cause of each great disaster and safeguard ourselves from horror striking again. Around the world, humanity exists only moments from catastrophe. Disaster bubbles below the surface of the earth, strikes from the heavens, or engulfs us from the sea. But we are not merely at the mercy of our planet. In our pursuit of industry, global connectivity, and reach for the stars, lives have been lost. Disasters reveal the best and worst of mankind, as one tragedy compounds another. How do these disasters occur? And what lessons can equip us when catastrophe strikes again? Human beings have been tapping the world's oil and gas at a rapid rate. Industrial oil wells have been operating around the globe since 1859. As easily accessible wells have dried up, we've been required to access remote reserves, like those deep below the ocean. These operations require extremely sophisticated equipment, mining rigs, like the Deepwater Horizon.
Drilling is a very technical thing. It's very impressive what they do. They're operating in very deep water, 1.5 kilometres deep. They can't anchor their drilling rig to the seafloor in that situation, so it's a floating drilling rig. Huge, massive piece of equipment that floats there and is dynamically positioned, which means it has its motors constantly running and its propellers turning to keep it in the right place using a GPS system. So it's just sitting there, absolutely on station the whole time.
In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon was carrying out drilling operations in the Gulf of Mexico. The warm waters of the Gulf are some of the strongest ocean currents in the world and home to more than 29 marine mammal species.
This was an exploration drilling operation. The geologists had told them there's probably oil and gas down there. So this was to determine just where it was and how much was down there.
It was a potentially dangerous operation. The $560 million rig was owned by Transocean, but was being leased to BP at the time. The exploratory oil well was just 80 kilometers offshore, surrounded by over 5,500 kilometers of populated coastline, of which the 4 major industries were fishing, shipping, tourism, and oil.
So to drill, they first of all got to drop their equipment down through 1.5 kilometres of water to the seabed. And then they've got to go through about 4 kilometres of rock.
It was challenging work. But finally, 5.5 kilometers below the rig, they struck oil. However, due to a culture of negligence and reckless conduct, underpinned by corporate greed, one of the largest environmental catastrophes in US history lay just around the corner. Humanity owes a lot to man-made fertilizers, chemicals like ammonium nitrate.
Without ammonium nitrate as artificial fertilizers, we wouldn't be able to produce the amount of food we have to sustain the world's population.
The industrial storage of such a widely used product should not pose risk.
By itself, ammonium nitrate is not that dangerous a substance. It can be transported in a pure state. But as soon as you start to mix in some amount of a carbon-based material, then it can have more explosive properties.
Introduce as little as 0.2% of a carbon-based material, and ammonium nitrate is compromised. Add the smallest of sparks, and it almost instantly breaks down into two gases, nitrous oxide and water vapor. The rapid conversion results in an explosion. The explosive potential of ammonium nitrate is utilized in commercial mining for excavation. And sadly, it's also been used by terrorists. In the infamous Oklahoma bombing, ammonium nitrate resulted in the deaths of 168 people. Negligent storage of the chemical fertilizer can have similar, devastating results. At the West Fertilizer Company in the city of West in Texas, ammonium nitrate was being stockpiled for the purpose of enriching farming soil. However, on April 17, 2013, the plant caught fire.
And we're sitting there watching the fire, and then all of a sudden a big old explosion happened.
Next thing I know, shrapnel was falling down everywhere, burning all of us, and we just got out and ran.
It's estimated that around 30 tons of ammonium nitrate exploded. The force of the explosion was the equivalent of about 11 tons of TNT.
More than 150 buildings were damaged or destroyed.
Right now, we have a tremendous amount of injuries, probably over 100 injuries. We do have confirmed fatalities.
15 people lost their lives. The unstable nature of ammonium nitrate has long been recognized, well before it was synthesized for industrial use in 1909. So how could such a disaster result in such a toll? There were a number of factors that contributed to the severity of the accident. Firstly, the fertilizer plant was not in an isolated area.
Some of the buildings were up to 50 meters away, including playgrounds, schools, and a nursing home.
The nursing home was obliterated by a shockwave equivalent to a 2.1 magnitude earthquake. Concerned locals quickly rushed to the aid of the home's residents.
When we got to the retirement home, there were some people that were just trapped in the rooms. They had sheetrock that was on top of them. You had to remove that. The halls had debris in it.
Further to the nursing home, a school was located nearby.
Fortunately, it wasn't a school day. Otherwise, there would have been a lot more injuries, especially with people watching the burning fire.
It seemed extraordinary that a school could be so close.
As the city of West developed, more and more buildings were built closer to the fertilizer plant without any consideration of what was stored there.
There were no zoning restrictions that prevented residences, schools, and businesses from being built so close to such a hazardous facility. Many residents were not aware of the risks posed by the plant. The West Volunteer Fire Department were also ill-informed. Responding to the blaze, the firefighters were unprepared for an ammonium nitrate-related emergency. Ill-equipped to assess and manage the disaster, 12 of the 15 killed in the explosion were emergency responders.
No words adequately describe the courage that was displayed on that deadly night. Thank you so much.
Investigators tried to make sense of the tragedy, but the cause of the initial blaze was never determined. but they did reveal a range of inadequate practices managing, transporting, and storing the ammonium nitrate.
One, the fertilizer was stored in a wooden building, which clearly is a problem when it comes to things combusting. Two, it appears that they would transfer ammonium nitrate from different storage bays that may introduce contaminants that could have potentially accelerated the combustion of the ammonium nitrate.
The residents of West Texas suffered a very real tragedy. But many of the same conditions and failings would cause a much greater disaster in China only 2 years later. The coastal metropolis of Tianjin is the fourth most populated city in China, home to more than 15 million people. It is the largest port in the north of the country and serves as a depot for a variety of goods. August 12, 2015. Among the containers populating the harbor, a hazardous chemical storage facility owned by Ruihai Logistics stockpiled a range of volatile substances. Regulations requiring the facility to be located at least 1 kilometer away from public buildings were ignored. And just as in West Texas, many local residents were unaware of the present dangers. That evening, an escalating series of events would trigger a sequence of disasters.
The Tianjin explosion is one of the most terrifying pieces of footage I've ever seen. Just when you think the explosion can't get any bigger, there's another explosion.
The detonations injured around 800 people and killed at least 173. But it could have been much worse. Fortunately, the accident happened at night, outside of the port's peak operating hours. Reports of a fire at the facility had begun circulating around 10:50 p.m. Firefighters soon arrived on the scene. Unable to contain the blaze, they attempted to quench the fire with water. It was a fatal error. The emergency responders were unaware that there were tons of calcium carbide stored at the site.
Calcium carbide is a compound that reacts with water to produce acetylene gas. Acetylene gas is a very, very dangerous material. There's a lot of energy stored in acetylene. A small balloon of acetylene would be enough to deafen me if I was to ignite it in front of me. This is a very, very powerful reaction.
Unaware, the firefighters had generated explosive conditions.
So the first fireball was caused by the detonation of the acetylene.
However, the acetylene was not the only volatile substance stored on site. Paperwork was later discovered, revealing an 800-ton stockpile of ammonium nitrate at the warehouse. The initial explosion had exposed the ammonium nitrate to contaminants, triggering a second.
So the second explosion was on the order of 20 tons of TNT being ignited. This is a massive, massive explosion.
当时有一种感觉是以为是空袭或者是一种，因为出来是火海，总觉得像是一个大空袭一样。
So the shockwave blew out windows, caused glass to fly through people's accommodation, and then there were questions around contamination from chemicals from the blast.
Fires caused by the initial explosions continued to burn uncontrolled throughout the weekend. But that wasn't the only problem. The explosions had blasted calcium carbide across the neighborhood.
If you have calcium carbide blown away from the scene of the explosion, You could easily have that littered in the streets, which could then form acetylene if it was to get wet.
In other words, there was the potential for mini explosions if it rained. In the aftermath, local residents protested, frustrated that such a dangerous plant was so close to their homes, and seeking compensation for all that they had lost.
真不知道怎么样，反正房子没了嘛，那一下，就想政府以后怎么再解决我们这个问题吗？
But much more distressing were the distraught families of firefighters still missing, days after the blast.
我们跟他们有讨论，哪们还那个携程这个电费就收不了行不？光说携程多少消防战术，我们还是有的携程就没分了啊。
你都是死大住了，这辈子大包体打死了。别那么急，别那么急。
Final counts revealed that 95 firefighters perished in the accident. The inquiry determined that the chemicals themselves should have been safe. It was the manner in which they were stored which was to blame.
They weren't licensed to store the quantities of materials that were present, particularly with the proximity to homes.
The explosions of Tianjin aren't the only example of negligence and poor safety practices compounding in a series of escalating events to create a wide disaster. After securing the oil well in the Gulf of Mexico, the exploratory crew on the Deepwater Horizon were already turning their attention to future projects.
This is an exploration rig, they've done their job, they've got to move on. And then at some later stage, much later perhaps, a production vessel will come in and connect this well to production facilities, and away they go.
Oil wells, in essence, are just very deep holes in the Earth's extremely high-pressure crust. To stop the oil and gas exploding out of them, they must be sealed securely.
What you have to do is put in a cement plug at the bottom of the well, make sure it's working properly, so that it will stop the oil and gas layers that may want to come in and force their way up the well. So that cement plug is absolutely critical.
With the cementing complete and deemed successful, the crew stopped monitoring the well, but they should have never underestimated the pressures deep underground. On the 20th of April, something terrible happened. Highly flammable oil and natural gas somehow burst its way up the well toward the rig.
So this material erupts with enormous force on the deck of the Deepwater Horizon, and it finds an ignition source. Explodes with enormous fury, a massive fire.
The initial explosion engulfed 11 workers close to the source.
We have no idea where the 11 people unaccounted for personnel are at this time, and we're going to continue to search.
The bodies of those 11 were never found.
The fire is still burning. It's a hot fire. It's on the rig itself. It's coming up the riser to the rig. Our effort must be to put the fire out.
Supply boats descended upon the oil rig, battling the blaze.
Slowly, we're trying to take the load. Okay, we're taking the load. Slab is clear.
115 people were evacuated, and the Coast Guard airlifted the crucially injured to hospitals. The fire could not be subdued.
It burnt the rig for 2 whole days before the rig finally sank.
The blaze was finally quenched, but now a different disaster was unfolding.
You've still got this release of oil and gas coming from the sea floor.
The catastrophe was far from over, and it would continue to cascade into the worst environmental tragedy in US history. Over the decades, chemical pesticides have kept crops free of invasive pests. To produce these chemicals in industrial quantities, large facilities must handle extremely toxic substances. Neglectful management of these substances can have fatal outcomes. India, 1984. The Union Carbide India Limited pesticide plant was situated inside a highly concentrated shantytown in the city of Bhopal. On December 2nd, there was an incident at the plant which resulted in a release of gas that flowed into the surrounding neighborhood.
The accident happened in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, many people were sleeping. A lot of people, they got gassed.
1 बजे से भगदौड़ पड़ी तो हम उठ गए। हमने खिड़की खोल दी, 3 खिड़की थी, गेट भी खोल दी, उसी तरफ दरवाजे थे फैक्ट्री तरफ। तो वो भर गई तो पूरे मतलब हम और हमारा छोटा लड़का मतलब बेहर कमरा में हो गए। इन्हें जगह जे उठे तो अंदर से ने कुंडी बंद कर दी, मतलब बाहर से कुंडी बंद करके हमें अंदर कर दी। हम आते तो घबरा गए, तो फंसू करार लगो, आंखों में आंसू आ गए। हम लड़के को लेके छोटे वाले को गोदी में लेके हम भाग गए।
The citizens of Bhopal were unaware that they were in the midst of the world's worst industrial disaster.
Something around 2,300 people, they died overnight.
But that was merely the immediate fatalities. Others exposed to the gas received horrific injuries. And with time, the death toll steadily mounted.
Fast forward to the 30th anniversary of Bhopal, 2014 December. According to a report of Amnesty International, 23,000 people died as a direct result of Bhopal.
The plant that unwittingly released the toxic gas was owned by America's Union Carbide, which would later be sold to Michigan's Dow Chemical Company. As the decades crawled on, victims and activists around the world would protest the actions of Union Carbide as further generations continued to suffer the fallout from the disaster. Those affected would burn effigies of the then Union Carbide CEO, Warren Anderson, and call for some form of recourse for their pain.
People have suffered enough. They won't let Dow do business in India till it cleans up the toxic waste in Bhopal.
It wasn't the product pesticide that killed. It was one of the chemicals used to make it. Methyl isocyanate.
So in Bhopal, they were using methyl isocyanate to produce the pesticide carbaryl. They weren't producing that much at the time of the explosion, so they were stockpiling the methyl isocyanate in underground tanks.
The extremely large quantities of methyl isocyanate, or MIC, should never have been stockpiled on site.
The quantity of gas released was 42 tons. 42 tons, when we expand it into a gas, is about 6 Olympic swimming pools full of the gas.
Methyl isocyanate remains lethal, even when extremely diluted. And on December 2nd, it was released inside a densely populated area.
The pure quantity meant that it was impossible for people to get away from the gas.
Only a small quantity of MIC is required to reach toxic levels. And people quickly inhaled it.
If it gets into your lungs, it can damage the tissues, leading to them filling with fluid, and you can effectively suffocate with your own lungs.
For the 2,300 victims on December 2nd, it was a horrible death. How could so many people be exposed to such a dangerous substance? The tanks at the pesticide plant, which contained the excess MIC, were somehow contaminated by an unknown water source.
So it appears that a quantity of water was added to the MIC tank. That leads to decomposition of the methyl isocyanate.
The decomposition produced heat, and that led to the disaster.
Methyl isocyanate boils at just under 40 degrees Celsius. So that heat inside of a massive tank very quickly boils the methyl isocyanate, giving the liquid into a gaseous form.
The gas exceeded the volume of MIC in its liquid form and continued to expand beyond the confinements of the tank, until finally it leaked. Union Carbide paid out $470 million in compensation to the Indian government in 1989, placing responsibility for the cleanup in the hands of local officials. 336 tons of hazardous waste is still present at the dilapidated plant to this day, despite an order from the Supreme Court directing the state government to clean up the site.
तो हमारी लड़ाई है मतलब 6 मांगों की कि हम लोगों को पुनर्वास चाहिए, इलाज चाहिए, रोजगार चाहिए, जो हम लोगों की मजबूरी है। हम लोग आपको बताएं क्या हम किलोओं से दवाएं खा गए और आज भी हम लोगों के बैगों में दवा है और हमें इस बात का खुद दुख हुआ कि सरकार पानी नहीं पिला पा रही तो खाना क्या खिलाई।
India charged the Union Carbide CEO, Warren Anderson, with manslaughter, but he remained a fugitive from Indian justice until the day he died.
I think the real tragedy is that the individuals and agencies responsible remain unpunished so far, even after causing the worst corporate massacre in history.
7 former senior employees in the Indian subsidiary were found guilty of death by negligence. Many locals thought the sentences they received weren't enough, especially given the level of negligence. In the Gulf of Mexico, Deepwater Horizon's uncapped well was spewing oil into the ocean at an alarming rate of almost 10 million liters a day.
You've still got this release of oil and gas coming from the sea floor. And the next job that BP needed to do then was to find a way to cap that.
Terrifyingly, there was no obvious solution.
They didn't have the technology at hand to do it. They had to improvise.
While BP scrambled for solutions beneath the ocean, cleanup crews leapt into action on the surface.
And today, and especially over the next couple of days, are going to be very critical days out at the well site. Our focus today was to look at the skimming and in situ burning activity.
Operations involving the Defense Force dropped almost 3 million liters of experimental dispersants at the site of the wellhead. The purpose was to break down the oil so that smaller droplets in the water were more easily consumed by microbes. However, action at the site could not keep up with the amount of oil released, and cleanup efforts ballooned to involve 7,000 vessels and 47,000 people. Planes and helicopters crisscrossed the ocean, collecting aerial data in an effort to map the spread of the oil and coordinate response teams. Satellite imagery provided projections of the oil's path.
For this oil response, we've used every technological technique we have available and reports from the public to identify where the oil is and where it may be going.
Amongst health and safety concerns, commercial fishing operations were shut down. However, many fishermen, witnessing the destruction of their livelihood, turned their efforts to helping contain the spill.
We're ready to hurry up and get out there and try to save something.
To cordon off slicks, containment booms were deployed, floating barriers designed to prevent the spread of surface oil. Small vessels would then collect what they could.
The big focus of our operations right now would be on water skimming, try to deal with the oil as far offshore as we can. We're being inhibited right now by the weather.
Efforts were hampered and the spread of oil worsened as waves driven by Hurricane Alex pushed oil to the beaches. Unencumbered by the rough conditions, a Taiwanese oil tanker exceeding the length of 3 football fields was deployed to the Gulf. The tanker was repurposed and refitted to ingest 75 million liters of oil-infected water per day. Once collected, it was hoped that tanks on board would distill the mixture, separating the oil before returning the water to the sea. Unfortunately, the oil-skimming capabilities of the tanker turned out to be negligible in contrast to the smaller operations dotting the Gulf. Further ecosystems were contaminated as the oil reached the marshlands.
This crew in front of you is using a drum skimmer to collect oil out of the marsh through the least intrusive means available.
But crews would continue to fight a losing battle until the well could be capped. BP had made various attempts, but it was 85 days after the disaster before they had success. Eventually, 2 relief wells were drilled, each intersecting with the original borehole. Cement was then pumped in, stemming the tide of oil. By September 19th, the well was declared safe, but by now, the environmental catastrophe was enormous.
The Deepwater Horizon oil spill stands as the largest oil spill disaster in U.S. history. It surpassed the Exxon Valdez oil spill that happened in 1989 and also was larger than the oil spills that were caused by Hurricane Katrina.
Almost 500 million liters of oil were disgorged into waters rich in marine life. Furthermore, the cleanup methods also caused alarm, as the dispersants used were essentially delivering further petroleum on top of the oil.
Then this may have created a second major environmental disaster that we also need to be thinking about. Is there's the oil, and then there's what we put on top of the oil to try to disperse it.
Some environmental organizations fear that the dispersants contained hazardous toxins and cancer-causing agents, whilst posing a direct threat to sea turtles and bluefin tuna. Countless marine organisms died.
Disastrous environmental consequences. People will have seen these very sad pictures of pelicans and other large birds coated in oil and dying a slow and miserable death.
The devastation of marine life had domino effects on related industries.
We fishermen, that's my only source of income. And honestly, I don't want to get in the oil cleanup business if I don't have to.
The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was absolutely devastating to many of the coastal communities along the Gulf Coast that really rely on shrimping, fishing, and other resource industries that are concentrated in that area.
I'm just hoping once they clean it up that it ain't years until we go catch oysters again, you know? That's the only thing I've ever done. That's the only thing I know.
The cleanup took many months to bring about, and I don't know whether the fishing industry has yet recovered to where it was.
As the impacts continued to spread far and wide, there was no doubt who was to blame.
BP is responsible for this leak. BP will be paying the bill.
However, the inquiry into the cause of the devastating accident would uncover further revelations of their culpability. The Ukrainian town of Pripyat was founded in the 70s to service the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Once a thriving home to 50,000 people, it has laid desolate and decaying for over 3 decades, since the citizens fled in 1986. On the 26th of April, there was an explosion in reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl power plant. A nuclear meltdown was in progress, although the operators didn't initially realize.
Operators thought it was just a simple explosion and that they started to run to see what is happening.
They arrived to discover a fire had broken out and the nuclear core was exposed.
When these operators came back to the control room, their skin went dark just as that you get an intense suntan because of the exposure that they got to the radioactivity over there. This is called nuclear tan.
The operators were only exposed for a matter of minutes. but were already suffering radiation sickness.
The body is bombarded with energy from neutrons and the decaying nuclei. You can have skin burns where you've had large amounts of radiation onto the skin. You can have central nervous system shut down. You can have cardiovascular shutdown.
A lot of them suffered and some of them died because of radiation poisoning.
Nuclear reactors around the world vary in design, but essentially they all generate electricity in the same way.
The nuclear reactor core is where the nuclear reaction takes place. The fissile material exists and it generates heat. The heat which is generated in the nuclear core gets absorbed by the cooling water. Water is very high pressure and super hot. Then it generates the steam, and the steam runs your turbine, and the turbine is connected to generator, and the generator generates electricity.
On the tragic day of April 26th, operators at the Chernobyl plant were trying to determine whether the plant would function in the advent of a power failure.
Operators were starting to run a test, and the test was to see how the reactor cooling system starts to work at a low power.
The reactor was lowered to only 6% of its normal output. The control rods, which slow the reaction of the uranium, were automatically lifted from the reactor. The power suddenly surged, and the control rods could not be lowered back. Cooling water started to evaporate, and the rapidly expanding steam blew the reactor's cover. The blown cover kicked off a chain of disasters as a gigantic refueling machine, situated above, toppled into the reactor, triggering a series of explosions. The Chernobyl power plant was compromised, and radiation was now leaking into the nearby Soviet town of Pripyat, home to many of the plant's employees.
Even people that were sitting in the city of Pripyat, the plant employees, they were doing sunbathing at the time that reactor was exploding and burning over there, because Soviets, they did not inform the public. And this is, to me, is a big tragedy and travesty and crime against humanity, that you expose your own people to radiation and not telling them to take cover.
The firefighters first at the scene had no idea what they were dealing with.
These firefighters arrived, they were totally ill-equipped. In fact, they are considered, the nickname for them, they were human robots or liquidators. And they started to basically extinguish the nuclear fire with water. And some of them, they even took the pieces of the graphites which was blown out from the guts of the reactor by shovel, and they carried that with shovel. They were badly exposed.
But firefighters weren't the only responders to suffer. The World Health Organization revealed that 240,000 recovery workers toiled at the site in the 2 years following the event. Of these people, tens of thousands died, and many more were left disabled.
Когда это случилось, я даже дату помню точно, 30 ноября 1986 года, когда это сразу все. Крови, много крови, обморок.
While the Soviet Union would hail the liquidators as heroes, many struggled to have their participation in the cleanup recognized, as a new Russia distanced itself from the mistakes of the past. However, those close to the Chernobyl site were only the first to suffer. A radioactive plume continued spewing from the reactor. The cloud carried cesium-137, which requires 30 years to reduce to half of its radioactive potency.
The plume or the fallout came out from the reactor. It started to travel toward east.
But of all the former Soviet republics to suffer the radioactive plume, Belarus was worst hit.
There was a rain that came after a few hours. That's why the city of Gomel, that city and the agricultural land around there is one of the most heavily contaminated.
Agricultural land would need to remain fallow well into the following century. But at the time, the Soviet Union concealed the dangers from their own people.
Гуляли там, купались в речке. Он купался, правда, я не купалась, холодновато было. Вот, ну, ходили там по болотам, лазили. Вот. И это было в начале мая, а в начале июня я забеременела.
Many Belarusian infants suffered severe birth defects from exposure. Some children were born deaf or blind, where others had such severe brain damage that they barely had basic animal reflexes. Eventually, the radioactive plume was detected in Sweden, and it was only then that the world learned of the disaster.
Все вы знаете, недавно нас постигла беда. Авария на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции. Она больно затронула советских людей, взволновала международную общественность.
In the following weeks, the cloud of radioactivity wafted across Europe. Wherever it encountered rainfall, radioactivity washed out and contaminated the ground below. Contamination that would remain to this day.
There was an issue recently in the Czech Republic where boars were eating wild fungus. The fungus had concentrated cesium, and therefore the boars were quite radioactive, to the point where it was recommended people don't eat the meat.
At present, more than 5 million people live in areas that are considered to be contaminated from the Chernobyl accident. And the question remains to this day, how could such a disaster happen?
The root cause of the problem at Chernobyl was the safety culture. It was the safety culture at the plant level and safety culture at the Soviet Union nuclear industry level.
There was a very strong hierarchical management structure. It was difficult for workers to question unsafe procedures.
These frontline operators, some of them, they objected to that procedure for running the test. In fact, there are several documents about that.
If their views were given higher priority, perhaps the tragedy would have been avoided. Attempting to contain the disaster, the Soviets encased Reactor 4 in 200 cubic meters of cement. The sarcophagus was hastily completed on the 22nd of December, 1986. But there was a problem. The enclosure was only designed for an average lifetime of 25 years. As the years passed by, the threat of Chernobyl hung over Europe. In 1992, the Ukraine government held an international competition for proposals to construct a new containment facility. 394 entries were received. However, only one proposed a sliding arch, limiting the amount of time workers would need to be at the site. After 7 years of construction, the new confinement structure was rolled over Reactor 4 in 2017. Even with the reactor sealed, some locations in the vicinity of Chernobyl won't be inhabitable for another 20,000 years. The disaster in Ukraine is far from forgotten, and the mistakes made, exacerbated by pressures from upper management, continue to plague industry today. Just 6 months after the Deepwater Horizon sank, over 8,000 animals were dead, adding further pressure to some already endangered species. The inquiry into the spill would reveal a number of pressures, and corporate and government missteps helped generate the disaster.
Stop the madness now! Hold BP accountable! Shut them down!
One of the most notable factors concerned the concrete plug installed to stem the well.
The engineers had chosen a design for the construction of that well which made it particularly difficult to get a good cement job. They'd done that in order to minimise cost and maximise speed. They knew that this was going to increase the risk of cement failure, but they went ahead and did it anyway.
The engineers ignored the risks in order to placate their bosses, the drilling managers.
Those drilling managers are the people who will determine their future careers, and they know very well that in order to satisfy those drilling managers, they need to maximise speed, minimise costs. So they basically accept second-best engineering practice in order to satisfy those drilling managers.
The lack of independence between the managers and the engineers created an environment of compromised safety.
It's a sad day when someone could kill 11 people on an oil rig and then not be held accountable.
Tests were performed to ensure the security of the plant, but monetary pressures would determine the outcome.
So they did the test. The test results showed that at the first opportunity, this well was going to blow out. That was what the test results showed.
But the company ignored their own results.
So they redo the test in other ways. They find ways to reinterpret the results they've got, and eventually they convince themselves that the cement job is good.
The pressures to work fast were purely financial and added to the eventual failure.
One of the really root causes of the accident was the speed at which they were drilling, and they weren't drilling carefully enough.
BP hired the Deepwater Horizon rig from Transocean, costing the best part of $1 million a day.
The pressure on BP to drill fast is overwhelming. They have a variety of incentive systems to make sure that everyone is focused on drilling as fast as they possibly can. So the rate of drilling becomes a key performance indicator, which is included in the bonus systems which all these workers are eligible for. So the pressure to drill as fast as they can is just irresistible. And as we know, speed in that situation is the enemy of safety.
There were a series of checks and controls in place to minimize the impact of a breach. But due to technical failure and oversight, none prevented the disaster. The Deepwater Horizon accident encapsulates a culture concerned with risking safety and the environment in favor of profits.
Well, trials are about justice, and this is justice that's been a long time coming.
The savings they made were minuscule in comparison to the costs of the various decisions they made. It cost them $60 billion.
In our modern age, people across the planet have benefited greatly from the advancements and products of industry. However, exploitation of workforces and a disregard for vital safety procedures places ecosystems and communities at risk of catastrophe.
It depends upon how rigorous these companies are in putting in place procedures and following those procedures.
A strict regard for safety must permeate every level of industry.
Pay attention and then go for a healthy safety culture at the level of executives all the way to the level of plants.
Corporations must constantly assess their own practices as a safeguard against the next disaster.
Это было в начале мая, а в начале июня я забеременела.
Absolutely, it's possible for this to happen again.
And have plans in place in the advent of calamity.
This is a lesson that we have to apply to everywhere in the world. Always think about the unthinkable.
Conquering space is a magnificent achievement.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It is the only time that any nation has been able to rally around a national commitment of so much significance.
But it has come at great cost. Rocketry is dangerous.
You're literally purposely setting something that is naturally combustible on fire and trying to constrain it to get thrust.
In our pursuit of the stars, astronauts have burned to death during tests. They have perished upon launch.
All of a sudden, there's just this huge explosion. They did not die until they impacted the water.
They have been stranded 330,000 kilometers from Earth.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
And astronauts have died, returning home. Mankind's exploration of space has typified our species' ingenuity and resilience. But our journey has been plagued by mishap, disaster, and death. Around the world, humanity exists only moments from catastrophe. Disaster bubbles below the surface of the Earth, strikes from the heavens, or engulfs us from the sea. But we are not merely at the mercy of our planet. In our pursuit of industry, global connectivity, and reach for the stars, lives have been lost. Disasters reveal the best and worst of mankind, as one tragedy compounds another. How do these disasters occur? And what lessons can equip us when catastrophe strikes again? NASA's Apollo program is an extraordinary achievement. It brought space to the people.
The target was the moon. And it wasn't an abstract target, it was something people can come see with their eyes. The idea that there would be someone like you walking around this thing, I think really captured the imagination.
And when Neil put his boot on the moon, the entire world placed that footprint on the moon, not just Neil.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And those first moments, blew me away as a kid. But as an adult, you look back and you think, how did they achieve all that? So many things had to go right, and they were using 1960s technology.
It is the only time that any nation has been able to rally around a national commitment of so much significance.
It captured the essence and the best of humanity, and that it's discovery and cooperation.
Although NASA had experienced tragedy and death behind the scenes, the enormous success of Apollo 11 lulled the general public into complacency about the dangers of space travel. That perception would be shattered only 9 months later with Apollo 13. Preparations for the mission were just like the others, moon trips having become almost routine. The two previous trips, Apollos 11 and 12, successfully carried Americans to the moon. Apollo 13's objective was to explore new lunar territory, the Fra Moreau region, home to a large meteorite crater. The three quietly excited explorers were astronauts James Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. Two days into the mission and 330,000 kilometers from Earth, disaster struck as an oxygen tank exploded aboard the service module.
Apollo 13 was...
When you're out in space, a couple of days from Earth, the last thing you want to hear is a bang. And that's what they heard.
With the clock ticking, NASA scrambled to bring Apollo 13 home safely, under the most trying circumstances they had ever faced.
It's one of the most extraordinary stories of rescue.
Both the launch and retrieval of Apollo 13 would require hard lessons learned from previous missions.
Apollo 13 is NASA's most successful failure.
It wouldn't be the first or last time that mankind would face peril in an effort to journey from the Earth. Space disasters have occurred at every stage of the technology's development. There's no greater contrast than the horror of war and the nobility of reaching for the stars. Yet the roots of space exploration lie in the Second World War. Germany achieved major strides in space exploration technology in the form of the V1 and V2 rockets that filled the skies of London with terror.
We wanted to understand more about that technology that they had developed with the V2 and the V1.
As the Second World War came to a close and the Iron Curtain was drawn, both the United States and Soviet Union each clamored for technological superiority. Both East and West snatched up German scientists and engineers, initiating tit-for-tat ballistic weapons programs that would determine the world's most powerful nation. But as the Cold War heated up, each side turned their gaze to the stars in a pursuit that would encapsulate dominance: the space race.
When you have competition, when you have race, that's when great things happen. World records and Olympic records are never set by the person running down the street. They're set at the Olympics, where you have the best and strongest and fastest and brightest competing all at once.
But the race was fraught with danger and mistakes as each nation pushed toward a moving finish line. First off the starting block, the Soviets. On October 4th, 1957, they astonished the world by launching the first satellite ever into orbit, Sputnik 1.
You would go outside just to see the spy satellite that was flying over. We weren't sure what this technology was doing. It was certainly more advanced than anything we had here in the United States.
The US needed to move into a sprint, establishing NASA in 1958. They set a landmark target to put the very first person into space. It was a bold goal.
First of all, the challenge of putting a man into space was not easy. It was very, very difficult. We had to understand how to safely launch a human being from the ground into space and orbit the planet.
NASA began Project Mercury with 7 astronauts known as the Mercury 7. But in 1961, the Soviets beat the Americans to the post. On April 12th, just after his 27th birthday, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to enter space and orbit the Earth.
He only did one orbit, I guess, and came back, but he was up there.
Gagarin's feat was backed by weapons technology. The Vostok rocket that projected the cosmonaut into orbit was derived from the Soviet R-7, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. But the Soviet track record with early ICBMs was far from clean. Less than a year before Gagarin's flight, a prototype missile malfunctioned on the launch pad. At least 100 people were killed in the blast, and as many injured. But this did not deter the Soviets from pursuing the technology. America's space program ran parallel to Russia's, with Project Mercury employing the United States' first intercontinental ballistic missile, the Atlas, to achieve the dream of space. Designed to deliver a nuclear warhead, the Atlas was repurposed with the intent to carry a human being. Tests soon began, with primate pilots. But the Americans suffered their own setbacks. On the 20th of February, 1962, astronaut John Glenn bravely took his place inside Friendship 7 the same missile that had exploded during tests only 3 months earlier. Glenn orbited Earth, rocketing through space at a blistering 28,000 kilometers per hour.
It was only when John Glenn got up there and did 3 orbits of the Earth that the Americans kind of caught up.
The Americans had achieved orbit, but were still lagging behind the Soviets. The US needed a new target. So began the Apollo missions.
The goal really was set by President Kennedy, and Apollo's goal was to get people to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Apollo 1 was to be the first flight of NASA's lunar program. However, it wouldn't go to the moon. It would just orbit Earth, conducting a series of trials. A week before the launch, there was a full test run on the launch pad.
The test was a plugs-out test. We wanted to see if the spacecraft would operate successfully and properly under its own power. So normally when you would have a spacecraft in the launch complex, you would be feeding it power from the ground stands and the ground support equipment. But this was a simulation. It was a simulation just as though you were getting ready for a launch.
On January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee boarded the Apollo 1 command module. But problems began almost immediately. The communications were phasing in and out. Indeed, they were so bad, Grissom commented on them.
Now we gotta get to the moon. We can't fly between 2 or 3 buildings.
It was kind of a premonition of what was to come.
Tragedy struck at 6:30 in the morning when a massive fire broke out in the capsule. The fire killed all 3 astronauts within just 90 seconds. Six days after the disaster, NASA set up a review board to investigate the tragic beginnings of the Apollo program.
This was an unfueled attempt. They really wanted to make sure that the capsule itself, the Apollo, kind of almost a dry test run. And that's actually what led to its untimely disaster. The fact that it wasn't a full test, they didn't treat it as a full test. They didn't take the proper safety precautions. They didn't do the proper protocols.
The investigation quickly determined that a major contributing factor to the fire was the atmosphere inside the capsule.
We were operating in a 100% oxygen atmosphere. That should have been a major flag to all members of the program. This was a significantly hazardous test.
Once the astronauts were sealed inside the capsule, it was filled with pure oxygen and pressurized to be 15% higher than the atmosphere outside. The purpose was to expel nitrogen, preventing the astronauts getting the bends.
The bends can be a problem in space.
Just as if you go scuba diving, you get more pressure the further you go. The higher up you keep going into space, the less pressure you get.
When a person experiences a rapid decrease in pressure, bubbles of nitrogen gas can form in the body, causing the bends. This decompression sickness is painful, even deadly, but the risk can be eliminated by getting rid of the nitrogen and breathing pure oxygen. During the test, the pure oxygen environment was exposed to a stray spark, presumably fired from faulty wiring near Grissom's seat.
Now, one of the fallacies that people have frequently is that, oh my God, oxygen burns. Oxygen does not burn. Oxygen supports combustion. The critical issue here was that materials that normally would burn at room temperature are just inflamed and consumed very dramatically with 100% atmosphere.
The investigation discovered that a range of inappropriate materials inside the cabin were compromised by the excess oxygen.
The two most notable materials were the spacesuits. They were made out of nylon, very flammable material. And 100% oxygen in the atmosphere is even worse.
A quarter of White's spacesuit had simply melted away.
And then we have Velcro.
There were 3 square meters of the nylon-based Velcro on board.
It wouldn't have taken much in terms of a short circuit for just one little spark to just ignite the cabin instantly.
Oxygen and flammable materials weren't the only culprits in the accident. Another problem was the capsule's hatch.
Because it was pressurized inside and the door was inward opening, it was very hard to open the door.
The pressure inside the capsule, 15% higher than that outside, pushed outward at the walls of the craft.
In order to pull that hatch open, you had to overcome that resistance. So basically it was like opening a bottle that's got a suction on it.
So the astronauts would have trouble opening the door. The rescuers on the other side would have trouble opening the door against the pressure.
The inquiry determined Grissom had tried to open the hatch, but to no avail. The Apollo 1 astronauts knew what they'd volunteered for, and fittingly, a plaque that tributes them reads, Ad Astra per Aspera, a rough road to the stars.
The astronauts who had signed up, most of them had been fighter pilots, so it either served in World War II or even in later conflicts in Korea. And they were mostly test pilots, so they were used to doing more experimental things that have a higher risk. And so they had a mentality that they knew what they were doing was genuinely risky, but it was ultimately a lofty goal.
NASA did learn a great deal from the tragedy, ensuring the deaths were not in vain. The flammable nylon suits were redesigned for future missions. The pure oxygen environment in the capsule at launch was also abandoned. Instead, the astronauts just breathed oxygen in their suits. NASA also only constructed outward opening doors from that point forward.
One of the outcomes of Apollo 1 was that NASA really said, hey, we have to do complete protocols. We need to make sure this is safe. We need to take every precaution, list every sort of hazard, and make sure this is done properly.
I still maintain that had Apollo 1 not happened, fire could have happened later in the program, and it would have been the end of the program if it had happened on the way to the moon.
April 11th, 1970. Preparations for Apollo 13's own rough road to the stars were underway. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert would attempt one of the most dangerous endeavors our species ever has, using some of the most dangerous equipment we have invented. All the Apollo missions required pushing an enormous amount of weight beyond Earth's gravitational pull. A new type of rocket had to be built for the program. The monstrous Saturn V.
Once they decided to go to the moon, they had to, they were taking 3 astronauts. They were taking a lot of equipment. So they had to develop these enormous rockets.
It was powerful, 5 engines, had the lift capacity for the Apollo Command and Service Module, plus the Lunar Excursion Modules.
The Command and Service Module, or CSM, was where the crew would spend the majority of their time on the voyage. The cylindrical service module would provide propulsion and electrical power systems for the command module, which was where the crew's cabin was located. The command module doubled as the re-entry vehicle for getting the crew back to Earth. The Lunar Excursion Module, or LEM, would transport the crew to and from the Moon's surface, rendezvousing with the orbiting CSM for the return journey. The tremendous weight of the components required an incredibly powerful launch vehicle.
Saturn V was the largest launch vehicle that we had ever built. It was an incredible machine.
You know, they're over 100 meters long. Now, you imagine a 100-meter run, how far, and that's just straight up. And when full of fuel, they weigh something like 3,000 tons. That's 1,500 large cars, all of it lifting off the ground against gravity.
The vast majority of the Saturn V's 100 meters was full of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. When mixed together, they created an explosive reaction.
You're literally purposely setting something that is naturally combustible on fire and trying to constrain it to get thrust. So you're creating thousands and thousands of mini explosions on board hundreds of thousands of kilograms of fuel source.
Taming these volatile substances was one of NASA's greatest achievements.
11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3.
The engine's firing. You have this tremendous vibration. The tremendous impact of the shock wave and the sound and the roar that's delayed. You see the flash. Then a few seconds later, you feel the pressure wave and you hear the sound, and it's just deafening.
Control Houston, we appear to have a good first stage at this point.
The Saturn V still holds the record for lifting the heaviest payload and remains the only rocket to have taken humans beyond low Earth orbit. Apollo 13's dangerous launch proceeded to plan, but disaster was only days away. The Apollo missions were revolutionary, but to truly transition into the space age, spacecraft needed to be reusable. And that was the purpose of the Shuttle program.
It was envisaged that eventually it would be used in an aircraft-like way, that it would take off, operate in space, come back and land, and after a few days could be refueled, refurbished, and take off again. And of course, it never ended up being like that.
One of the reasons was that space shuttle launches were expensive. The program averaged out at about $1.5 billion per takeoff. Still, 5 different shuttles flew a total of 134 missions.
The Space Shuttle program was a fantastic program. People criticised it because it wasn't going very far. They were always in low Earth orbit. But that is space, and they were doing some interesting things.
In an attempt to reignite the public's interest in the shuttle program, on January 28, 1986, Challenger was going to transport the US's first civilian into space.
Today I'm directing NASA to begin a search in all of our elementary and secondary schools and to choose as the first citizen passenger in the history of our space program, one of America's finest, a teacher.
After a nationwide search and 11,000 applications, 114 teachers were shortlisted, with 10 finalists being put through their paces at the Johnson Space Center.
NASA has always been about striving for education and inspiration. What better way to inspire the next generation of scientists to have a teacher do their own experiments?
The teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe. Is that you?
here we were taking a citizen, a teacher, who was actually going to conduct lessons from space.
I mean, the whole thing is so gorgeous. You just want to bring it all back into the classroom for the kids.
There hadn't been so much interest in a launch for a long time. It was important things went right. But problems began the day before launch.
Launch control at T-minus 20 minutes and holding.
There was a cold spell that came in, weather front, and we had some of the lowest temperatures they've ever seen in Florida at the Cape, at the launch pad. It was actually causing freezing, causing icicles to form.
We're in a unscheduled hold to determine what action should be taken about ice.
Despite concerns expressed by some of the engineers, the decision was made to launch that vehicle.
Because this was a teacher, it was showed in a lot of schools and a lot of classrooms,
including McAuliffe's own classroom.
People have estimated 17% of the entire US population was watching the single liftoff.
Among the dignitaries and journalists that gathered to see the launch at Cape Canaveral was McAuliffe's mother.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
And then all of a sudden, off the side of one of the solid rocket boosters, there's this plasma jet of flame. Now, if you're an engineer, you know that. That's a problem.
The Space Shuttle program had suffered its first real disaster. Three days later, a memorial service at Johnson Space Center was attended by almost 10,000 people, and President Reagan spoke in honor of the deceased.
Sometimes when we reach for the stars, we fall short, but we must pick ourselves up again and press on, despite the pain.
I think, what played on everyone's mind then was, it exploded just 73 seconds after launch. How long did those astronauts live for? What did they see? What did they witness in the end? It's a horrible thought.
The inquiry into the Challenger disaster would attempt to answer some of those questions. But first they had to figure out what went wrong. It was revealed that the cold weather had been critical.
The problem with the Space Shuttle is that in some ways it was too successful. It was really only ever an experimental vehicle. What we think of as the Space Shuttle was actually a combination of a launch system that consisted of the orbiter vehicle, which is the winged vehicle that sat attached to the external tank, to which the two very large solid-fueled rocket engines that would be reusable.
After launch, the solid rocket boosters would detach and parachute back to Earth, where they would be collected, refurbished, and reused. To assist the refurbishing process, the rockets were not one solid case.
They were actually made in sections that were joined together and were sealed by what were called field joints.
The field joints were covered with large rubber O-rings. These O-rings were not graded to operate in the temperatures experienced at Cape Canaveral, and one had given way. Unable to contain the explosive reactions within the rocket booster, the field joint began spewing hot plasma, leading to a catastrophic failure of the whole launch system. Disturbingly, the inquiry revealed that at least some of the 7 crew survived the initial explosion.
We had designed the spacecraft so that the crew module was a separate pressure container inside the fuselage of the orbiter vehicle. So when it detonated and exploded and ruptured, you see this small object separating out of the fireball. And what that object was the crew module.
There is evidence that at least, I think, 2 of the occupants turned on systems, oxygen systems on board.
They did not die until they impacted the water.
It was a very dark chapter in NASA's history book. It would take the best part of 3 years before another shuttle would launch. April 13th, 1970. Another form of darkness had swallowed the Apollo 13 mission. Having revolved around the Earth, using its gravity to slingshot toward the moon, the crew was sailing through space 2 days from home. Up to that point, the smooth journey was on track to being the Apollo program's most uneventful mission, prompting the capsule communicator at Mission Control to say, "We're bored to tears down here." But that evening, disaster struck.
When you're out in space, a couple of days from Earth, the last thing you want to hear, I'm guessing, is a bang.
They described it as a jarring or bump to the spacecraft.
You got to remember, in space, there's no sound. You're in a vacuum. And so the only sound would be what would be transmitted through the hardware in the spacecraft.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
A short circuit inside one of the 2 oxygen tanks on the service module had ignited.
One of the oxygen tanks on board had a heater in it. It detonated and completely blew out section 4 of the service module.
The instruments indicated oxygen tank 2 was completely empty, and tank 1 was at half capacity. Power systems were damaged, water had been lost, and the Apollo 13 service module, which housed the crew, would be out of air in 3 hours. The mission was aborted, and a new course plotted. Apollo 13 would slingshot around the moon, losing radio contact before returning to Earth. Although this shaved crucial time off the return journey, it would still take 3.5 days. In the emptiness between the Earth and Moon, NASA's first tragedy in space loomed.
Here is a bulletin from ABC News. The Apollo 13 spacecraft has had a serious power supply malfunction that could cause the lunar landing mission to be terminated early.
Because of Apollo 1 and the disasters, they wanted to figure out as many things that could go wrong as possible. So for every Apollo mission, they would have a scenario where they would say, what can go wrong? And then they would fix it. They'd actually run what's called the lifeboat scenario for Apollo 8.
In the event of a catastrophic failure of the service module, the lifeboat scenario required the crew to transfer to the lunar module. The problem was, the lunar module was designed to house 2 astronauts for only 48 hours. Would it have enough oxygen, power, and water to allow the crew to survive for 4 days? NASA's Army of Engineers, assisted by Apollo 8's crew, began simulating the trip. The problem with losing oxygen was twofold. Vital to the astronauts' life support, the oxygen was also used by the fuel cells to generate power for the re-entry systems.
They'd lost oxygen. They couldn't use their fuel cells to recharge the batteries in the command module. So they thought, well, we've got to come back. We've got to make the re-entry in the command module. So we better preserve the battery power. So they did that by moving out of the command module into the lunar module.
There was sufficient oxygen on board for the crew members, but it had to be treated. There was a lithium hydroxide canister that actually processed carbon dioxide out of the air to make it breathable.
The lunar module had some canisters, but not enough to prevent the astronauts suffocating. canisters would have to be repurposed from the service module. But this wasn't a straightforward process.
Well, this was a classic case of the canisters on the lunar module design were a different shape than the ones that we had in the Apollo. And so literally we had a round canister and a square canister, and how do you mate the two of these together? With just materials available to them, how could they solve this problem? And it was a case of going around and finding, what have you got? Well, we got a roll of tape over here, we got some Velcro over there, we've got some glue over here. But this is what engineers do. Engineers are problem solvers.
Relaying instructions to the Apollo 13 crew, NASA's engineers walked them through the construction of the makeshift system.
And no one panics. You can even hear the transcripts, and there's this calm, and this is what we have to do.
This is where a lot of the training that they had been given earlier became critical. And not just the training as crew members for the hardware, but a lot of them were actually part of our design team.
With 15 minutes of oxygen left in the service module, the repairs were completed, and the crew moved into the lunar module.
Most people quote that the accident and the disaster of Apollo 13 couldn't have happened at a better time. And the reason you say that is they were just far away enough from the Earth that they still had most of their supplies, but they hadn't gone to the moon. So if they had gone to the moon and come back and then the disaster had taken place, Apollo 13 doesn't have the lunar module. It's on the moon. They have no lifeboat.
But it would be days before the crew was scheduled to return home, in which time they had to travel further than any human had traveled before, losing contact with the Earth as they crossed behind the moon. And all that stood between them and the vacuum was a hastily patched craft. By the turn of the millennium, NASA's space dreams were well and truly back on track. The Shuttle program had recovered from the Challenger disaster 14 years earlier, and with world partners, NASA was building an enormous laboratory in orbit, the International Space Station. Both the ISS and Shuttle program would serve as platforms to conduct research in microgravity across a variety of fields. The crew that launched aboard Columbia on January 16, 2003, embarked upon a 2-week mission of research and education.
Zero-G baseball.
Wow, Willie, that was impressive.
What else can we do?
Special good morning to my wife, Rona, the love of my life.
Among their assembly of moss, bacteria, and moths, they carried a collection of tiny worms, hoping to determine the effects of gravity on cell organization. The 113th flight of the Shuttle program initiated deorbit as planned. It was a routine journey home for the premier shuttle of the fleet.
Columbia flew the very first mission, the first space shuttle mission, and it flew 27 highly successful flights.
At 8:44 on the morning of February 1st, Columbia entered the Earth's atmosphere, 120 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. The shuttle's descent would exceed the speed of sound, 24 times over.
So you get friction from your vehicle, your space shuttle, your craft coming in. The friction of the atmosphere is rubbing really fast, causing a lot of heat. That's what's causing that burning up look.
Some plasma now.
Columbia was purpose-built to withstand the heat of re-entry, which reached an estimated 1,370 degrees Celsius. But something was wrong. Sensors on the left wing recorded strain, exceeding that of the shuttle's previous descents.
A number of alarms went off on board the vehicle that suggested that temperatures within the wheel wells of the undercarriage were being exceeded.
Then, the wing's sensors died, before Mission Control lost contact with the crew. Columbia's crew module completely depressurized before shredding to pieces only a minute later. there was no chance of survival. NASA's Shuttle program had claimed another 7 lives.
When you get into Texas, there are multiple debris fields from the Dallas metro.
The trail of Columbia's carnage was strewn 400 kilometers across 3 American states. In order to solve the puzzle of how this tragedy occurred, the pieces needed to be recovered. In the months following Columbia's demise, thousands of volunteers joined one of the largest organized ground searches in history. The sense of shared duty to recover the shuttle exemplified the importance of the space program to the general public. As technicians at the Kennedy Space Center began sorting debris for reassembly, they made a startling discovery. A series of canisters containing the worms for biological study had survived impact. The worms, with an average life cycle of 8 days, were at least 4 generations descended from those launched aboard Columbia. As investigators began to reformulate pieces of the shuttle's wings, the key to the Columbia's demise slowly came to light. The roots of Columbia's tragic re-entry could be traced to the day of the shuttle's launch.
The extraordinary thing is that it was so simple. What caused the problem? A piece of insulation foam broke off during launch.
The main fuel tank of the space shuttles were filled with sub-zero liquid hydrogen and oxygen. Ice could often form outside, causing damage during takeoff.
There's a condition that's called the twang. And the twang is this entire stack and assembly will actually kind of move as much as 4 feet in some cases. And it's just responding to the energy that's coming out of the engines.
To prevent the buildup of ice, the tank was covered in thermal foam. But during Columbia's departure, a piece of this insulation broke off and struck the shuttle's wing.
A lot of people would say, well, wait a minute, you said foam. If I throw an empty styrofoam cup at you, you're not going to duck. It's a styrofoam cup. But if I take that styrofoam cup and I fill it with water and I freeze it, you still want me to throw it at you?
I believe that we have found the smoking gun. I believe that we've established that the foam block fell off of the external tank was in fact the most probable cause, the direct cause of the Columbia accident.
The foam had dislodged vital insulation tiles.
The structure of the space shuttle is actually similar to the structure of most modern aircraft. It's an aluminium frame, because that's a highly efficient way to build an aircraft. The difference with a space shuttle is aluminium gets very weak and loses stiffness when it gets hot, but the space shuttle protected that aluminium structure using its thermal protection system, using the space shuttle tiles.
The ceramic tiles were key to the concept of a reusable space shuttle.
Specially made ceramic-coated tiles mounted on the surface of the spacecraft make it possible for the shuttle to withstand repeated heating and cooling, up to 100 round-trip flights without replacement.
With just a small section of tiles missing, Columbia's re-entry was compromised. With an abscess in Columbia's left wing, the shuttle was exposed to extremely heated atmospheric gas, which pushed through into the craft. The superheated plasma built up in the wheel well, causing the wing to tear from the shuttle.
And of course, with the wing coming off, the vehicle becoming unstable, you just see the breakup of the spacecraft and scattering it over hundreds and hundreds of miles of Texas and Louisiana.
I think that was probably the nail in the coffin for the space shuttle program. I mean, sure, it was going to eventually be phased out, but you get 2 disasters in a row, and that's a serious thing for the public to have to deal with.
It was determined that the Columbia crew couldn't have fixed the problem, even if they were aware of it. Columbia demonstrated how perilous a routine re-entry could be, even for the leading space technology of the 2000s. But for the crew of Apollo 13, 33 years earlier, there were more hurdles to overcome before they could even attempt the same dangerous descent. As Apollo 13 limped out from the moon's shadow and radio contact was re-established, the world shared a collective sigh of relief.
The crew of Apollo 13.
But the problems were not yet over. The lunar module could never survive re-entry. The damaged command module, void of oxygen, could possibly make the return trip to Earth. But without being able to inspect the extent of the damage, there was no way of knowing if the heat shield was intact. Separating the service module from the rest of the craft, the astronauts got their first look at the extent of the damage.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. The whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine. It's really a mess.
If the initial explosion had damaged the heat shield, the astronauts would burn up on re-entry. But it was their only option. The tension during those final minutes was enormous.
Odyssey, Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Astonishingly, the rescue of Apollo 13 was a brilliant success.
Apollo 13 is NASA's most successful failure.
The successful race to save the lives of Apollo 13's crew was a testament to NASA's planning and tough lessons learned in the past.
It probably was the disaster of Apollo 1 that actually led to the Apollo 13 success and the astronauts actually surviving that trip because they were so precautionary because of the Apollo 1 disaster.
It's one of the most extraordinary stories of rescue. I don't know of anyone that doesn't have a sense of pride in terms of the achievement of solving a serious problem like we had in Apollo 13 and rescuing that crew and bringing them back safely.
Great pleasure just to be back here on Earth, believe me.
Despite all the setbacks, humanity continues to explore space as technology, imagination, and endurance set new destinations.
We had people that couldn't wait to get to work in the morning. We knew every day it was going to be more failures and more problems, but we were building towards something that no one had ever achieved.
Each new frontier to be conquered is filled with danger and risk.
Space is always pushing the bounds of what we need to do technology-wise, which means you have to deal with very dangerous stuff in a very controlled way. And as soon as something goes wrong, you end in a disaster.
But the human spirit to find purpose in new goals seems unquenchable. Out of the ashes of disasters past, a new aspiration is now on the horizon.
Just as people wanted to go to Antarctica, just as people want to go to the deepest parts of the ocean, we now want to go to Mars. And we will get there, and I'm excited to witness when that first human sets foot on Mars.